Good evening. We are in 1 Timothy chapter 5 in our class. First Timothy chapter 5. First part of this chapter deals with having respect or showing respect for others. And we talked about a little bit last time we were together and how our society has really downplayed that aspect of our culture and that how we do not see people showing respect to each other. We see them not showing respect to law enforcement or to their school teachers, to older people in general, and how that has kind of trickled down just in our society alone. And really, we are able to see the negative impacts of that, and in everything as we look around. But as you start this chapter in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 1, here, it's talking about do not really, literally, strike at harshly. That's what the word rebuke, not an elder, which is just an older person. We're not, in this particular verse, dealing with the shepherd of the flock or the overseer. We're just dealing with the individuals that are older. And so you have the way in which you deal with problems, issues, confrontation, what have you, is you entreat someone that is an older man as a father, and then you deal with those that are younger men as your brother. You would treat older women as your mother, as also the younger women, as well as your sister. And then for Timothy specifically, the admonition is to have purity in his interaction also with those young women. So you can see the significant influence or significant emphasis that's upon respect here. Then in verse 3, honor widows that are widows indeed. Again, you have that word honor showing that, again, very much respect, high regard to those that are widows. And then it's going to deal with that quite a bit, actually, as you move throughout the chapter. And dealing with those that are widows, there are those that are widows indeed that are actually destitute, those that do have a significant need. And the Bible tells us that we are to honor those widows who are in that circumstance or in that situation. Sometimes, some places, some cultures, they do not honor someone that is older. And if that older person is destitute, they do not treat them with respect and certainly do not provide any provision for them or care for them. And that's a shame. It's very sad. But the Bible teaches us as Christians that is very important and that we need to make sure that that is a part of our Christian walk. Now in verse 4, he says, but if any widow have children, or the King James says nephews, other translations say grandchildren. So if a widow has children, grandchildren, then they are to first show piety at home. The word piety, it comes from the word in some places that would be translated worship, but it has to do with showing, really paying homage. It has to do with showing a significant respect towards. So if there's a widow who has children or grandchildren, those grandchildren are to show her significant respect and to, show that in the way that they treat her, and that's really the context that drives it home, and to requite. Now, the word requite means to pay back in some way. Now, is there anything to pay back to our parents? Yeah, if they're what they're supposed to be, right? But, you're in existence today because, well, you weren't aborted. So that was a good start. And you did arrive here. And so you were given an opportunity to have life. And then you were cared for. Diapers changed, and clothes on your back, roof over your head, food in your belly. You were able to grow. And then provisions for many, many years. And so here we have an opportunity then, not only as children, but also as grandchildren, to make sure that we not only show great respect toward and pay honor to the one that is a widow, our mother or our grandmother who is a widow, but also to pay them back. And certainly it absolutely is. And as you move further down in the verses, you'll see that being brought out so that the church is not burdened, so that it does not have to take on that obligation. And really, the responsibility here, first of all, it should really, the taking care of should just flow out of who we are as Christians. That's the point. We're to respect each other, and it should be shown in how we deal with each other. We shouldn't be dealing with each other very harshly or striking at each other. That's the word rebuke here. It's different than the rebuke that's found in other passages. The original here means to strike at very harshly. And so it says we shouldn't be doing that, but we should entreat. It doesn't mean that we don't deal with problems, or if there's sin, we don't deal with it, but it does deal with how we do this, how we deal with each other and interact with each other. And then if there's widows, they ought to be paid respect. And if you have family members, if it is your mother, your grandmother, and of course you could flip that over, not just the female, but your father, grandfather, widow, widower, then there is provision that is to be provided by the family members, and not only to show respect to them, but also to pay back their parents. And the Bible says it's good and acceptable before God. So not only is it just a good thing, like if you had good parents, you feel good about doing that, but if you had rotten parents, the Bible still commands you to do it. And that's the hard part, because it's good and acceptable before God. So even if your parents didn't do a good job, then you still have an obligation as a New Testament Christian to do the right thing. And so, sometimes in a marriage, people will say, well, my spouses treat me rotten, then I can treat them bad, right? And they would use that as an excuse or an out not to fulfill any obligation they have toward that spouse. But that's not the way it works. God commands each individual in a marriage to perform their role in the way that God has asked them to do it, even if their spouse is not fulfilling that part, the other half. They got to make sure they're doing what's right so they get to heaven. And so individually here, then we have an opportunity to do what's right before God, and even if our parents were not what they should have been, we have an opportunity to be what we should be and to show that back to them. And who knows, if they're not Christians, maybe by our treatment of them, they may open their mind to obeying the gospel. And so here we can see that, how this works. In verse 5, it says, now she that is a widow indeed and desolate trusteth in God, continueth in supplications and prayers night and day. But she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth. These things give in charge that they may be blameless. So when we're talking about a widow indeed, so we're jumping back up to verse 3 for a moment. All right, so widows that are really destitute should be cared for. All right? And if you have family members, as a New Testament Christian, you should be caring for them. But then what about the church being able to assist if there are those that are just actually destitute widows that are in this situation? Who should support be provided for and cared for? Well, it seems to imply here we shouldn't be caring for those that are living in sin. So if they're rebellious and they're living in sin, then that provision is not going to be there. That's at least what it's implying in verse 6. Verse 5 says, the widow indeed is the one then that is not living wickedly or in pleasure. And so there's a contrast there and some limitation that is placed on it. In verse 7, these things give in charge that they may be blameless. In verse 8, really drives it home as we see the context, if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house. So, for any provide not for his own is a broader spectrum. Some would say, and there are translations that say relatives. So your own relatives. So this is a broader, not for if you're not willing to provide for your own. And then especially those of your own house. Then what? Denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. So it puts a little bit different meaning maybe to the way that we've seen that verse, which is, you got to provide for your family. And so go out and make a living. And so sometimes that verse is used only in that limitation or in that context. But when you put it here with the other verses, then what are we driving home here? Well, the context has to do with those that are destitute, those that are widows, that have no way or no provision. This would have had a significant import in the first century because of the culture. Women today may have the ability to go out and work and provide, but then, did they? Were they treated as the same in that culture and in that environment? They were not. And so if they specifically if they lost their husband, then they have nothing. In many cases, they were not able to go out and to provide anything, and so they lost their sole support and means of living, and they were going to have to rely upon those of their family, and then ultimately, if they didn't have any family, they have to rely on the family of God to provide that provision for them. So, if we do not provide for our own, broader context would be our family, our relatives, and especially those of our own house, then we cannot say that we are truly Christians. And that's the driving force that's there. And I mean, it's a very strong argument that is coupled with verse 4. To say you need to provide, this is an important part of Christianity and being disciples, that we need to be able to provide this. And so many times you find that people just overlook it. And we talked about last time how some were trying to get around providing for their family. In Matthew chapter 15 and Mark as well, where they were trying to cry Corban, they had provided a gift so that they could try to get around making provision for their parents and providing for them. And so they thought they'd found a loophole to get around it. They would just provide a gift maybe and to the temple or what. They're going to provide some gift. And then they felt like, well, I don't have any more money. I've given all my money to God, to the kingdom, and so I don't have to take care of my parents. So I'm good, And so I got a loophole. I provided Corban. That's the gift. And Jesus condemned them for trying to follow their traditions. And actually, by following their traditions, what had they done? They had violated the commandment of God by their own traditions, Matthew chapter 15. So it's very important that we don't try to do that we understand it is part of who we are as Christians, and showing the utmost respect for our family members for providing for them. And specifically in this context, those are the widows. Verse 9. Now, as we move into verse 9, it seems like we're talking, generically about widows and those that are actually widows, that are destitute. Widows indeed are those that indeed have a true need and they need help. And so then they seem to move into a separate category or division that is brought out from verse 9 on down. I think previously when I had studied this, I was thinking that the enrolled ones were the widows indeed. And I think I had connected those two and said they were the same. But actually going back and looking at this a little more closely, then when it talks about those that are taken in the number, they're put on the roll, they're enrolled widows. That's not just a widow who has a need. It's not just a destitute widow. Because there are qualifications that are provided here, and a distinction is made between them and what they would be doing. And so it's just different. And, if we had a widow that was under 60 who really was destitute, would we say, we can't help you? Well, no, we would not do that. Not a chance. We would have to do that. That would be a part of our responsibility. And so when you go down and you look at these qualifications that are here, the one that is the widow that is enrolled, they talk about them having very specific qualifications. One of them, I think it has to do with children. And, what if a widow didn't have any children? Could we not take care of her? She wouldn't fulfill that qualification. So to me, when we come to verse 9 and moving on down, we're talking about those that are added to the number, those that are enrolled, they're added to the list. this is something different. These are widows that have made a pledge or dedicated themselves in some particular service to the church for a particular work, and they are stating that they are not going to marry and that they are going to serve. And so because of that, then they are added on to this list, or this, what we would say is kind of like the budget, where they're being supported to do a work. So let's read on down the verses, and then we'll put it all together. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 9, let not a widow be taken into the number under 80 years old, having been the wife of one man. So there is a limitation to the one that is going to be enrolled and be involved in this particular pledge. Verse 10, well reported for good works, she have brought up children. So again, this to me tells me from verse 9 on down, we're talking about something different than just widows indeed. Widows indeed, a desolate widow who has no means of provision for her life can be helped. No matter what age, no matter if she has children or not, we can do that. This is talking about something different. And so, verse 10, well reported for good works, if she have brought up children, if she have lodged strangers, if she have watched the saints' feet, if she have relieved the afflicted, if she have worked diligently, if she have diligently followed every good work. Okay, so there's these qualifications that are provided. Wife of one man, good reputation, she's brought up her children, taken care of strangers, washed the saints' feet, has been, it seems to imply that some of this is what she's going to be involved in. Now she's making a pledge, I'm not going to marry again, and I'm going to dedicate my life in service to do those things that I've been doing. And then because of that, I'm going to be able to put on the list, I'm going to be enrolled as one of the widows that is put on that list. And then what about the younger? They said, well, they don't need to do that. They don't need to make a pledge that they won't marry again. If you look at verse 11, but the younger widows refuse. Refuse what? For them to be taken into the number, for them to be enrolled, for them to be put on the list. They are not then to be put on that list, for when they begin to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry. Seems really strange phraseology, but it implies that when a woman pledged to be on the roll and said, I'm not going to marry anymore and I want to serve as an individual who is not married, who is single in this way, as a widow, and I want to dedicate my life to this, and this is what I pledge before God, this is what I'm going to do, then she did not need to go back on that. And the point that is made here in verse 11 says, refuse, for when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry. Having damnation because they have cast off their first faith. And withal they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but tattlers also, and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. I would therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some are already turned aside after Satan. So you've got two separate groups here. You've got the younger, and they say they don't need to be put on this. They don't need to make this pledge. Jephthah, he got in trouble when he made a rash vow. And it's as if they're making a vow and stating that they are not going to remarry if they're 60 and above, and that they're going to serve in some capacity with the church, and they're going to be put on a roll, and they're going to be supported for what they're doing. And it seems that verse 10 would pretty much give us a list of some of the things they're going to be involved in, that is, in serving those that are in need. And then he says those that are younger don't need to make that pledge. They don't need to say, well, yeah, I'm going to do this, because they're still, what's the right word? Able, then to marry, or what somebody might say. They're eligible, and they're more than likely they're going to remarry, that kind of thing. Now, that desire. So, for them, they don't need to do that. And if they did make a vow, I'm not going to do it, and then they started having those feelings, and they're going to be in trouble, because then they're going to have to turn against Christ, because they made a vow to God, and they don't need to break that, but then they have all of these other desires, so they create a problem for them. So it says here, then they should not do that. And what's better for them is that they then marry and bear children, guide the house, and give none occasion or to the adversary. I'm going to pause there, and then we'll go on to verse 16. Any comments? We covered a few things. I think a good thing is you're mentioning here. I mean, these ladies are 60 and older. So some would say, well, it's time to retire. I've put in my time. And yet these ladies are saying, no, I'm ready to serve even more. Sign me up. Where can I pledge? I want to dedicate my time to serving God. And so they are ready to get busy. And so it does show that that's really a good thing, in their willingness to serve in that way. Mm-hmm. Right. No, I don't think so. And it may be, that they have the opportunity to place that focus. When you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul talks about that. In chapter 7, of course, it's time of during the present distress, great persecution, and he advises them, if you can do so, don't marry, remain single so you can stay focused. And in some ways, that may be an emphasis that is also here, that they can focus on that, and be dedicated to that. Whereas these younger, um, they have a different role. One says, you don't. It'd be better off if you don't marry here. You can focus on this. If you make that vow, you need to stick to it. Where the younger, they say, well, you need to, we need to grow the church. So, you have an opportunity to be in the home and to guide the home and to work in that arena and to bring glory to God there. You'll have your chance to be 60 and older if you make it that far. If you have that opportunity to get to that age, then you'll have your opportunity to serve in that capacity. But for now, this is your area of focus. I don't know if. What do you guys think? All right, shoot. It didn't. The word is not in the text.
To me, like everything that they're basing this on is in her past, not what she will do, but what she has been known to do.
Sure.
Is that right? I mean, she's not an employee. She's been taken care of because she has dedicated her life in the past to God. Am I missing something?
Well, what they would use is verse 11 to try to draw out the principle of a pledge to where they would serve. In most of the commentaries and stuff that I read, that's where they were drawing out that in the context, that's why they would separate this from being something that's different. They were providing some service, we don't know what it is, and that they were put on the roll and to serve. Because, why would there be an issue? And that's the question where verse 11 is, when it says the younger widows refuse, for when they begin to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry. Right, and that.
They have no family.
Mm-hmm.
They have no husband. Have no children, nor grandchildren. Somebody's got to see to them because they're old, they can't work, they can't provide for themselves.
Well, we don't know that they don't have children because she's brought up children.
Well, people are different. Men and women alike. Some are physically better off. A woman past 60, if she was still able to work and provide for herself, I don't really see where she wanted church to be taking care of her. Same way with a man. If he was 80 years old and able to work and provide for himself, he shouldn't be there on the handout, I wouldn't think. Christians should help these type of individuals that need help. But really, a Christian, you don't retire from being a Christian, do you?
No.
You can't age. You might get where you can't do as much.
Can't do as much. Or the same.
You're limited to what you can do. You can say, well, I've done my part. I'm going to sit back and let everybody else do it now. But you still need to keep working.
Sure.
Well, I think that's the reason why that's brought out, is that she should be a woman that does all these things and has done all these things. Because you don't, somebody that just comes in for a church handout, obviously, they're just there for the handout. They're not there because they truly need these things.
Mm-hmm. So that basically, what I've seen in the text and in my study is that going down, the first part of chapter 5 is dealing with widows that are just widows indeed, which is different than those that are put on the roll. Widows indeed can be helped. If they need to be helped, they can be helped. If they're living wicked lives, they can't be helped. Shouldn't be helped. And that's what's being stated in the first part of chapter 5. Then the second part talks about them being put on the list, and then based on what it is saying, which is, for example, in verse 11, for when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry, having damnation because they have cast off their first faith. Why is that? Is it because they were wicked? Or, what is the reason for that? Then with all they learned to be, and then it goes on to talk about what they could get involved in and the trouble they would be involved in. But he says, I would therefore that the younger women marry. And then... Mm-hmm.
And basically that's true with the young. And that's what I've wondered about all of this myself. But I can see now what they're talking about. So you take one over 62, I'd rather work for the Lord than, dedicate the rest of my life you know, they don't want to live like that person. They want to marry. But he's talking about supporting them, and then they go out and find a husband where they're making a deal with them. And they basically could take care of themselves.
Right. Right. Let's read verse 16 together, and then we'll come back to the comment to help draw it together. If any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, which ties back to what we've already dealt with in verse 8 and verse 4. If any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, and let not the church be charged that it may relieve them that are widows indeed. So no doubt, in this context, we have the church relieving widows that are destitute.
Verse 5.
Right.
They're different from the other widows that are mentioned here. They're the ones that doesn't have anybody.
Right.
They have no other resources. They don't have, you know, the retirement plans and all that kind of stuff. These are people that are in need.
Verse 8 separates them and not leaving. Two different types.
It appears that way. Now, I mean, when I previously taught this, and in my previous study, I didn't come to that conclusion. But I've studied a little more, and I may have seen a little bit different, and I may maybe have that missed. Maybe my first when I first thought it was correct, but it seems to appear that they've separated the difference between just those that are here at the beginning, and then when he talks about the people being put on the roll, that's not necessarily the same thing.
Those are the widows indeed.
In verse 9, I don't think so, because then that would limit the church from being able to support a woman who's under 60, who is a widow who is destitute under 60. And I believe the church has the obligation to support a widow indeed. And if she is under 60 and she's destitute, they have an opportunity to support her. Hmm.
Verse 8 is not happening.
Right.
Verse 15 talks about those that absolutely not happening.
Well, verse 9 is talking about, though if verse 10 is given the qualifications of the widows that the church can help, then the church, like Brother Adam's saying, then the church can't help anyone that's destitute under 60 or that hasn't had any kids and is still a widow and can't provide for herself. I believe there's a different set. That verse 9, this number is a set of widows that is being put to work, so to speak. In some regard, they have these qualifications. They've been a servant in these areas. But the widow indeed is the one that is defined in verse 5. She's desolate. She has no one. And those are the ones that I believe verse 16 is bringing out, that if the family won't help them, then the church has got to help them.
Well, are we talking about helping them or them depending on the church for all the support? Paying their rent, and light bill, and grocery bill, and all that?
It's a good question.
Or are they employed? Is it like a work relationship?
Those are all very good questions.
That's where
I don't have an answer. I can provide what I've gathered in my study because, you know, like I said before, I thought that when it was talking about widows indeed, that it was the people that were put on the roll and they were put on the budget, and then the church supported them. And they provided support to the widows that are destitute. And it could only be those that were over 60. But then I got to studying it a little further, and, you know, what if there was one that was under or that didn't have children? What if there was a widow who was over 60 who never had children?
you can still help those that are with commandment.
But she doesn't fulfill being put on the roll. Could she be then supported, though? What if she's 90 and she's a widow, but she never had children? She doesn't meet the qualification of the person to be put on the list. But can she be supported regularly? I think we would probably all say yes. So that's why, yeah.
For a short period of time, they go through a very difficult struggle, and then the husband, turn your back on
And of course, right, and I think that's kind of the discussion that we're having is what people would say being put on a list or enrolled would mean regular support compared to helping. Temporary. So then you're trying to figure out, okay, what exactly are we talking about here? Go back and dig in this, and then when we come back together, you guys just straighten it all out, and then you just... Mm.
So I think it's interesting. Mayor's definition says sit down and enlist or register to enroll soldiers or those who held a strong place in the church and exercise a certain superintendence over the rest of the women and charge of widows and orphans to serve as a person. It sounds like it's fair to say that if you find it as something like an office, a job, or something going on with that.
Yeah. So,
I think we just kind of look at the time here, it's growing. There's no persecution,
yeah.
no warfare, no publicity. If you've been living in this,
Yeah. That's very true.
today, you've got all kinds of programs to help people. So the church is not going to have to worry a whole lot about that this day and time. But when you go back, it says, do good to all people, if you have those things.
Right. So when we come back, you guys, we'll continue this. I'd like to move on. We're going to come back next time. Verse 17, let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially they who labor in the word and doctrine. It's interesting that we've been talking about support, and now we're talking about elders, actual elders, because we're talking about individuals that have the oversight, they're overseers, they have rule, and so now we're actually talking about the presbyteros, the shepherds, the bishops, overseers. That's who we're talking about here, and those that serve, especially and labor in the word and in doctrine, are worthy not only of honor, but double honor. Double honor is being paid. It's being compensated for the time and the effort that they put in. And we know that we're talking about money because of the next verse. For the Scripture saith, thou shalt not muzzle the ox that treadeth out the corn, and the laborer is worthy of his reward. So, no doubt, and it is interesting that we've been talking about providing support for widows indeed, and then we move on down, and even those elders that are serving in laboring in the Word and in doctrine also may be supported. I don't know that it happens frequently. I know of some elders that receive compensation as elders. They are not the full-time located evangelist or preacher, but they are supported as an elder, and they labor full-time, just as the text says in the Word and the doctrine. And so in this, what does it mean to muzzle an ox that treadeth out the corn? Yeah, he's working, but he ain't getting that out of it. They'd put him in a circle, and they'd put that all around there, and he's walking around, and he's stepping all over it, and they would just use the hooves of the animals to kind of crush that up. But if you muzzled him, you're going to make him work. You're smacking that thing and making him go round and round and round and round, and he never gets to eat. He's got to see it, sniff it, smell it, but he can't eat it. And so it's harsh, it's cruel to work somebody and not compensate them. And so that's the principle of an ox who's going around in a circle and working but can't eat. That's why he said you're not supposed to muzzle him. If you muzzle him, he can't eat. He can't enjoy the work that he's doing. But if you take that muzzle off, he'd be able to eat as he's going around. And so that's the principle that's there. All right, next time, you guys are going to have all the answers. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you guys so much for your attention.